I want to explain how pop records were made after the Second World War. Obviously there were no records made during the Second World War, and it took quite some time for the record business in England to pick itself up. If you wanted to make a record within, I suppose, 2 years of the war ending, the only place you could go was one of the major labels. And there were 3 major labels. There was the EMI group, there was Columbia, which was a sort of upmarket pop business, if you like, and then you had Parlophone, and Parlophone had the sort of titles that the executives at EMI thought weren't really elegant enough for the Columbia label. And then you had 2 other record companies, Pi and Philips. The whole of the industry was controlled by those 3 companies, and they would decide what records they would make. They had their own producers, in-house producers, that's salaried producers. And if a label didn't want to make a record, it never got made. Well, then 2 things started happening. One is that the industry ran out of staff producers. Often they would want to make a record, but had no one to produce it. So you started getting a splatter of independent producers. They would work for themselves, and initially they'd be contracted to one of the labels. At the same time, independent producers would decide that they wanted to make their own records, and they would do them on spec. They would find an artist, they'd probably go to a talent competition, they'd find an artist, they'd find a song. In those days, very few artists wrote their own song, which has totally changed to now in 2015, where I suppose the majority of records are written by the artist. So the producer would initially take an idea to a record company, and the record company would say, yes, all right, we'll make this, but you must do it in our studio. The first thing that the producer found when he turned up for the session was there'd be 4 or 5, no disrespect to them, I suppose. Oh, I don't know. There could be a bit of disrespect to them. Young, spotty-faced kids, 19-year-olds in their Burton suits, who knew nothing about records, and they would try and tell the producer how to record, what musicians to use. And the producers got fed up with that, because the record companies were still living in 1939. The equipment they had was the equipment that they had before the war. The engineers had probably been employed by the record company before the war, were then called up for the war, then got demobbed. Many of them had been operating portable disc machines on the battlefield. The only people at the end of the war recording music were the BBC. And the chairman at that time, Lord Reith, didn't like pop music. Of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, the record business never stopped during the war. And there were bands like Benny Goodman doing dance music and of course Glenn Miller recording dance music just to entertain the troops. So back to the UK, I've just said that the record producers were old, and they themselves had no great interest in modern popular music. They didn't understand it. They certainly didn't understand young people's choice of music, their needs, dancing. So gradually this culture of being independent, having independent producers and doing their own thing, but they were still bound by the rules of the record label. So these young producers would have their own ideas, and they wanted to get away from the old-fashioned traditional way of recording that took place before and immediately after the war.
Would you say at that point that the younger generation were looking for a new sound?
Oh, very much.
Yeah.
Yes. Dancing in those days was ballroom dancing.
Yeah.
You know, the quick step, the foxtrot, the waltz.
Yeah.
All very formal. And they really wanted music which was a little bit more modern than people like Victor Sylvester used to have a strict tempo dance band, and he would have a metronome. So a waltz would have 3 beats, 1, 2, 3, and he'd stand there conducting the band, 1, 2, 3, and it was timed. Later on you had people who are still around now, like Len Goodman, producing strict tempo. Now the problem with strict tempo was that you couldn't introduce any kind of swing. With swing, the tempo has to increase very slightly, but it's very, very subconscious. But it doesn't fit into the routine of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
So how did people go from recording in a record label recording studio to an independent recording studio?
Once one of these young independent producers had decided on the artists and the musicians and the arrangements and that sort of thing, and they decided that they wanted to go to an independent studio, to be away from the management structure of the record label, they looked for somewhere else where they would be given the freedom to do their own thing, where they were working with young engineers who knew what young people wanted. And so gradually independent studios started in London to open them. There was one very important studio which had been recording during the war, and that was the studio just opposite BBC's broadcasting house. It was called IBC, International Broadcast Company, which was started, funnily enough, in France by a Frenchman called Ploug, Captain Ploug, who was very modern thinking, and he decided to move to London and equip with new equipment. The record labels were still stuck with their old pre-war recording equipment. It wasn't possible to import recording equipment from the States because of import duty, and you had to get a license to import anything at all. So virtually every studio employed a chief engineer who would design and construct the equipment, apart from the tape machines. Obviously they couldn't do that. But at that time people were coming back from the army, from Berlin, where they'd found radio stations with tape machines. They'd never seen them before. They didn't even know that they existed or how they worked. And so after a couple of years, by about 48, I suppose, 49-ish, the equipment in the record label studios looked like the Science Museum. IBC had a collection of chief engineers. I suppose the most famous was Ian Levine, who used to design and make equipment. As other studios started, Lansdowne, for instance, their chief engineer designed their equipment. And so you now had another level of choice, because as each studio had equipment designed for them by their own in-house engineer, who all designed different equipment, record producers were not able to choose which studio they wanted to go to based upon the equipment they had and the acoustics of the studio. So it really was a bit like a sweet shop. Yeah, I think I'll do this record in that studio because I like their drum sound.
Yeah.
Next record, I'm going to go to that studio because I like their string sound.
Yeah.
Or I like the engineers in that studio because they can get a better brass sound than somewhere else.
What effect did the newfound freedom have with producers with regard to picking their own studios?
It was enormous, because if you think of somebody who's painting in watercolour or something, and when they start painting, they've got just one brush. Now they've got a collection of brushes. They've got more colour in their paints. They've got more material where they want to paint on paper or canvas. And that probably accounts for why independent studios took off so quickly, because the producers would use the independent studios as the toolbox, choosing the musicians, the equipment, the engineer. And eventually, the record label studios became swamped by new producers with new sounds. And because there were new sounds and new material, all staffed by young people for a young audience, that's why in the early 50s the record business suddenly took over.